this year, and we are very grateful for your creativity and your hard work and everything that you have already brought in our group. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Melmed, I'm very delighted to welcome you as well, but I will let Vardit make the announcements from here in the meeting.
Okay, thank you for the lovely introduction, Matt. Okay, which way? I'm not supposed to be facing this way. Okay, you got it?
Hey, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Avis and Eli, for taking care of all of that. So I'm going to start with the University of Maryland College Park land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed to their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral land of the Piscataway people, or the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder for each of us as two-leggeds to ensure our physical environment is in better condition than what we inherited for the health and prosperity of future generations. Now, I'm going to give you just a little bit of a plan for this event. I'm going to give a brief introduction because really experiencing something is much better than hearing someone talk about something. Then John will give us his wonderful performance. John and I will have a brief discussion about it, and then we will open questions to the floor. This event came out of my past personal stories of migration, recreating communities amidst dramatic change. And as I was planning this class, when I first met John, I said, oh, you have to come, you have to talk to my class. And he agreed. And then from that moment, we decided to create a much bigger event. But because it's part of my class, and I have, I'll say, encouraged my students to come here in exchange for their attendance marks. First questions will go to them. Okay. And my colleague Eli will be managing the online chat too. So anyone who has questions online can also send them in, and he will read them out for us when it's time. Okay, so a brief introduction about storytelling. So storytellers, they create stories, which doesn't mean that it's fiction. It means that they choose from their knowledge and their experience what is going to make a meaningful and an interesting and engaging story. They decide what's worth remembering, and they make those memories important to us, the audience. They shape these stories and they rehearse them into something that's worth listening to. I think we've all been there when someone's telling a bad story. When is it going to end? What was the point of that? Storytellers know how to craft a good story, whether or not we are judging it in our mind. We're entertained and we usually walk away with something. Personal experience stories are enjoyable, but they're also a unique relationship to history, where the storyteller takes from their own knowledge, their own experience, and they make that history emotive and engaging. It gives us insight to things we wouldn't have known otherwise. Whether or not we were at the event, we wouldn't have thought of it that way. If we weren't at the event, we would never have known, we would never have had that relationship to what happened. And storytelling events are always unique because they're created in that engagement between the storyteller, in this case, John, the audience, and the context. The storyteller might tell that story again, but the meaning will be different. The event will be different because the context is different, because you aren't there, or because you have gone through something different. That meaning is created in the relationship between the storyteller and the audience. You're creating meaning together with John today. That's just a brief introduction. I hope it gives you some things to think about as you experience these stories, as we enjoy John's performance. And moving from that, I'm just going to give you a very brief historical introduction to the South African Jewish migration to North America, because as I said, experiencing is much better than hearing me talk about it. So the Great Migration, which took place between about 1870 and 1920, was a time when millions of Jews left Eastern Europe to move across the world. And that led to a massive migration of Jews to South Africa as well as the United States. Less than 100 years later, as racist policies became more entrenched in South Africa, Jews started to reassess their lives there and started to see less of the future, started to become worried about the political realities as well as economic opportunities for them and their families. And so many South African Jews in the 1970s and 80s started to look for other places to call home. And a large percentage of South African Jews moved to other English-speaking countries, including the United States. And that's a very brief introduction. And John will give us a much more interesting insight into this history and his personal experience. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Don Melmed, who's a retired physician, as well as an award-winning speaker, storyteller, and speech educator. And has spoken at professional conferences, universities, government facilities, and theaters around the United States. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vardit, for making the mistake of inviting me to come and speak to all of you today, and to the staff and faculty, and especially to the students who are coming and sitting through one of my sessions of telling you and educating you about stories and a little bit about South Africa. So I immigrated to the United States in 1973 when I was 28 years old. I'm pausing because I know most of you are probably trying to work out how old is it. Well, I'll give you a break. I'll tell you, I'm 56 right now, and it's true. No, I'm 78. And so my story encompasses my experience in South Africa and my immigration here, and a little bit about my experiences in this country. So I must begin with my grandfather, Jacob Melmed. He had a much more interesting experience than I did, because in comparison with the experiences he had, mine were much less. So if I can compare his experience with mine, I've written down some of these differences between him and me, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about Jacob. So I left Cape Town for the United States when I was 28. He left Lithuania or South Africa, specifically for Cape Town, when he was 21 years old. I spoke English, he spoke Yiddish. I came with a wife, he came with his cousin, Paul Kruger. He spent 8 weeks on a ship ships coming from Lithuania to England to the United States. I spent 24 hours flying from Cape Town to Johannesburg to New York to Washington. I came with $10,000 in my pocket. He came with next to nothing. At best, he navigated around Cape Town in 1900 when he immigrated on a donkey cart and utilizing his sense of direction. I navigated around the Washington area where we came to in a Dodge Dart and a AAA map. So you see the stark differences between the potential of what he experienced and what I experienced 73 years later. Now, the other advantage that I had was that my wife, Rianne, has a sister who lives in Silver Spring. And so she enabled the two of us to come to get a green card. It was really easy to do so. And my grandfather had none of that. He came to South Africa, to Cape Town. He had a brother, Abraham Pinchas Melmed, who owned a Yiddish bookstore in Cape Town, which gives you some idea of how big the Jewish population was in Cape Town at that time. They all had come from Lithuania and other Eastern European countries. And so when I came here with Rianne, my wife, and she's sitting right there in the maroon shirt, we spent about 6 weeks getting to find our feet in this country, me trying to find a job, trying to find an apartment. It took about 6 weeks, and then we moved and I got my job. My grandfather had no intention of staying in Cape Town. He stayed with his brother for a few weeks, earning money enough to buy a ticket for him and his cousin to Johannesburg. And why were they going to Johannesburg? Because in the late 1880s, gold had been found in Johannesburg. The richest supply of gold anywhere in the world in the 1880s. How rich? So rich that 150 years later, it is still the richest deposit of gold in the world. Jacob, my grandfather, and his cousin Paul Kruger wanted a part of that. So they earned enough money to buy a ticket one way to Johannesburg. They climbed on board the train a few weeks after they arrived in Cape Town, heading for Johannesburg, a 2-day trip, 1,000 miles. I must explain a little bit about the politics of South Africa at that time. The Portuguese had established a station at the southeastern corner of South Africa, Cape Town, in 1692, something like that. And they did that because they needed a station for ships coming around. There was no Suez Canal. They were coming around the Cape all the way to Asia, and they needed a place where they could get fresh water, and food, and vegetables, and fruit, and that sort of thing. About 60 years later, no, actually about 160 years later, the British took over forcefully the Cape Colony. The Portuguese left to go back to Europe, but the farmers who'd been there now for generations decided they weren't going to leave. But at the same time, they didn't want to stay in Cape Town and be under British rule. So they migrated north into the hinterland of South Africa. And there they came across African tribes with whom there were battles and wars over the years. And they, up north, formed two republics, two independent Boer republics. Now, Boer is the Dutch word. I beg pardon, when I said Portuguese, I meant Dutch. They formed two Dutch Afrikaner republics. The language of these Dutchmen changed over that time, and the language became known as Afrikaans, and they're called Afrikaners or Boere, which is the Dutch word for farm. They were referred to how they pronounced it by the British was the Boers. And so these two republics were Boer republics. One was the Transvaal, which was further north, and the Orange Free State, which is further south. They both had presidents and functioning government. And at the time that my grandfather was traveling up north, the president of the Transvaal Republic happened to be a man by the name of Paul Kruger. So the train is left Cape Town about 500 or 600 miles into the journey. In the middle of nowhere, the train was stopped. And when people looked out the window, the train was completely surrounded by British troops. Why? Because they heard that the president of the Transvaal Republic, Paul Kruger, was on this train. Imagine the brashness of Paul Kruger to take a train from, and this was during the Anglo-Boer War, which was going on from 1890 to 1902. And Paul Kruger takes this journey from Cape Town back up to Johannesburg. Why would he do something like that? The British thought we got him because his name was there on the passenger list. They searched the train, and sure enough, there was Paul Kruger sitting on the train with his big moustache and his beard and a big hat on his head. But it was the wrong Paul Kruger, it was the Yiddish one. And after, I don't know, probably a couple of hours, they realized their mistake and they let the train keep on going. About 200 miles further on, they came to a little town by the name of Queenstown, in the northern part of the Cape Colony. The train stopped in Queenstown and they announced everybody on the train has to get off. The train is going no further because there's a war zone ahead. The Anglo-Boer War was going on. Everyone had to get off. The train is going back to Cape Town. And my grandfather Jacob and his cousin had no money to buy another ticket to come back. The train wasn't going any further. They knew no one. Queenstown was this tiny little town. They got off the train not knowing what to do. They knew they had to stay because they couldn't do anything else, a little tiny town. But, you know, I mean, Queenstown had a street. And what else could you hope for as a town with a street and a few buildings? Now, interestingly, they did something that any Jewish people would do under circumstances like this, dire circumstances like this. What did they do? They opened a wholesale company. It was called Kruger and Melmed. I remember seeing a picture of Queenstown, and there on the roof was the name Kruger and Melmed. Why on the roof? Well, maybe they must have tremendous foresight. Jews, they'd say the Jewish cop. Well, they knew that in another 50 years' time, planes would be flying over, and they'd see Kruger and Melmed, and they'd come and do business with them. I don't think that was the case. But so how did they, with no money, how were they able to form a wholesale company? They really did do this. Well, I forgot to tell you that I'd like all of you to turn your phones down so we don't be a barking dog. So the fact is that when Jews came from Lithuania, in particular to the Cape Colony, and other Jews from Eastern Europe, they all came from tiny little shtetls and villages around those countries. And so they tended to go to small towns in South Africa. Of course, the large towns also like Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. So almost every little town had Jews, and they helped each other. That was how Jewish immigrants survived when they came to countries where they were already Jews. And so my grandfather, I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but he must have had help from the Jewish community. And you know, it's a funny thing about these tiny little towns in South Africa and elsewhere. If you have enough Jews to have a million in any little town, just 10 Jews enough for a million, they'll form 3 synagogues. There'll be the Orthodox and the conservative and the Jews for Jesus. So Jacob was heavily involved in the Jewish community, and he had helping to set up his business with his cousin, and he was highly successful. So successful, he had nine children, all born in Queenstown, which indicates to you how boring it must have been in Queenstown. They had nothing else to do but had children. Typical. But he also then built a hotel in an adjoining town called Middelburg. He built a hotel. My cousin Eddie Melmed. Eddie, would you stand up, take off your? I said the family, these people would see. Don't judge folks for their relatives. So, no, I'm distracted. What was I going to say? So they built this hotel, and Eddie yesterday said to me that when they built this hotel in Middelburg, and also a tiny little town, these towns had no architects or anyone. Probably when Jacob and his 2 brothers who had come out to join him, they were probably discussing this, and someone walked by, happened to hear them, and said, "Oh, I know how to build hotels." So someone built the hotel for them, and when it was finished, they realized they'd forgotten to put in a staircase to the 2nd floor. Can you imagine something like that? And so they built a staircase outside leading up, and they must have broken a hole through so they could finish. But Jacob had a very successful career, 9 children, one of whom was my father. And Jacob, when he got settled, was heavily involved with the Jewish community. He helped the synagogue get established. And in fact, I brought with me this cup, which was presented to him by the Queenstown Jewish community. And it says, and I always have to look with a magnifying glass because I can't read this very clearly. Presented by the members of the Hebrew Congregation and Zionist Society to J. Melmed in recognition of valuable services rendered. Queenstown, 3rd of October, 2022. This is 100 years old. This is my grandfather's, and it's a treasured item for me. So to go from traveling from Cape Town to Johannesburg and ending up like this example and be successful, to stop in a tiny little town with no money is just an example of what is referred to as Yiddish kop. In other words, the Jewish brain. They were able to make something out of nothing. And this is so typical of Jewish immigrants, wherever they go, which is why worldwide you find that Jews are so successful in whatever country they've gone to. And the thing, in a way, I think it's lucky that they didn't end up in Johannesburg, because I don't think he thought it through. He had no money to dig for gold. He could either have joined a company and worked for them. I don't think he would do that, not with the entrepreneurship that Jews had and that he had. He would have wanted to dig for it himself. He would have had to buy equipment. Between him and his cousin, they didn't have enough money to buy a toothpick. And even if they could afford a toothpick, can you imagine how long it would take them to dig, and how long would it have lasted? A week or two or three. So, to get to my story, from Jacob to me, it's really difficult for me to tell the story without talking about the elephant in the room, apartheid. And the word is pronounced apartheid. Americans tend to pronounce this apartheid, it's apartheid. And literally it means apartness, separateness, complete, in the sense that it was developed by the Nationalist Party in South Africa in 1948. You ruled until about 1995, when multiracial rule came in and Mandela took over. They ruled with an iron fist. Total separation. And, you know, one of the questions that I've asked myself over the years, and I've asked it several times, thought about this: was I racist when I was in South Africa? Absolutely I was. And it was hard not to be. Because I was born in 1944, apartheid came into existence in 1948. Not like it hadn't existed before that, but racism was present in South Africa because all these white people came with their riches, and there were these poor African people who were very simple people, farmers. And so if I think about the reasons that I think I was racist, I think there were really two of them. One was that where I grew up, I lived in a suburb for white people only. I lived in a great big house on a half-acre of land. Behind my house was a sports field where my friends and I would play rugby and cricket and other games. I went to a boys' school only for whites. I went to theaters for whites, movie theaters for whites. When I went on vacations with my parents, it was to hotels for white people. The white people had more opportunities than the blacks did for jobs and for education. On the other hand, the black people had much less than that. They had some of it, not all of it, but they really were the workforce for building South Africa into the rich country that it became. The other reason I think that I can call myself racist is because when you grow up with that, you don't realize that you're growing up in a society, you just don't recognize it. And it was only when I became an adult, about 3 years ago, that I realized that I was a racist in that sense. And the other part of the factor of being racist in South Africa and not realizing it is that I had no African friends, no black friends. They all lived in their townships and villages outside of Port Elizabeth, where I grew up. They worked in the city, but I didn't have any as friends because they didn't live near me, and there were no Africans in my school. On my sports teams, there were white sports teams. If I went to a movie theater, the people I met were white people. No black people. Didn't know black people. If I had, it would have changed the whole thing. However, I did have contact with some non-white people. There were three races in South Africa: white, black, and mixed race, or colored people, as they refer to it, still are today. So in South Africa, almost every white household had maids or servants working in the home. Some of them lived in the home. So in our home, we had three servants. Two of them were colored women, they were sisters. It was Mariah, who was working for my parents for about 4 years before I was born. She worked for my parents for 50 years. She lived in our house. Most people who employ blacks who live on the premises have next to the house a little building, maybe one room with a toilet, maybe 2 rooms and a toilet for the black servants. Mariah, though, lived in our house. And if you went from downstairs up the stairs to the bedroom, halfway up there was a little room, almost like an attic. And she lived in that. And so everybody had servants in this kind of way, and they had free board, they had their meals with us, and they got paid. I have no idea what they were paid. I do know it wasn't that much. How did people determine how much they were going to pay their servants? Well, when somebody moved into a new house or a new apartment, or whatever it was, and they wanted to have a maid, they would go to the maid and say, so what do you pay people to work for you? And they would say whatever the amount was, and that was how you determined how much to pay. My parents, I know, paid more than what the going rate was, because that was the kind of people they were. So Mariah was there when I was born, and she cooked for our family, and she cleaned for our family, and she looked after me. She changed me, she bathed me, she fed me, she disciplined me, she wiped my butt, she did everything for me. She was more of a mother to me than my mother was. My mother was a socialite. She didn't work, but she worked for charities, and she played cards, and she had dozens of friends, and she was never home. When I came home from school, when I was of school age, Mariah was there to greet me, to give me something to eat, and ask how my day was. So she played a big role in my life, but I didn't realize the significance of Mariah until I came to this country. And here's a valuable lesson for all of you. When I joined Toastmasters 27 years ago, when you're in Toastmasters, you have to give speeches. If you think of your own, you're not told what speeches to give, you come up with your own speeches. And I thought, well, gee, what can I talk about? I've given so many, and I thought, gee, I talk about Mariah, this American audience in my Toastmasters, but they don't know anything about maidservants in South Africa and apartheid. I'll talk about her. So when I actually sat down to write the speech, it came to me the real importance of Mariah, that she was formative in my development, in my understanding of who I was and of races. Because she was totally, our family was her life. She came to us as a young 17-year-old. She worked for us until she was well into her 60s before she retired. And only after writing that speech did I realize the love that I had for this woman and how much she loved me. She did more for me than my mother did. I'm ashamed to say that. And something that happened years later really had a big impression on me. I always felt guilty about Mariah, that I hadn't really recognized her or thanked her for what she did for me. I never thanked her. I mean, I was nice to her, kind to her. Once when I was a student in college, I said to Mariah, I said, I'm going to take you to a movie. I was explaining movie theaters, movies for black folks and movies for whites. Couldn't take our non-white staff to a movie, but Mariah, being a color, was very light-skinned. And she was nervous. I said to her, I'm going to take you to a movie. I'll pretend that you're my aunt from a country somewhere. She dressed in her best clothes, off we went to this movie theater. She loved it. So just little things like that were payback from me, but it wasn't the same as thanking her. So when I was in this country, my youngest child, Darren, was 13 years old. I went back with her. I used to visit South Africa maybe every 3, 4, 5 years. My mother came over about twice. My father passed away when I was 25. And I decided that on this particular trip, I was going to go to Kaplan, which was the little village that Mariah had returned to when she retired. And I was going to I took a whole lot of money with me, and I was going to go to Kaplan and make sure that she was living in reasonable circumstances, that she had a roof over her head, she had decent furniture. I knew that she'd be living with her family. And I didn't know how to tell my mother that I was going to take away 2 days from my time with her. I was there for 2 weeks. I didn't know how to tell her, so I didn't tell her. I arrived in South Africa and had all this money. Darren knew we were going to do this. And then 2 days before we left, I thought, I have to tell my mother. I can't just get in a rental car and drive off. I have to tell her. I said, Mom, I brought some money with me, extra money, and Darren and I are going to drive and visit Mariah in your home to see how she is. I want to see if she needs anything, get her a television set if she doesn't have one. I knew she wouldn't have a phone, so I couldn't call her. In fact, I couldn't communicate with her. Mariah didn't know I was coming because she was illiterate. I couldn't write to her. I couldn't call her. My mother didn't have her address, but she occasionally would receive messages or a letter from a member of her family. And so I told my mother that I'm going to do this, and as cool as a cucumber and without any emotion, my mother said to me, but John, Mariah's dead. I was shocked and saddened and angry at my mother, who didn't realize the significance that Mariah had in my life. My mother made up some excuse that she didn't want me to be upset. But Mariah had this tremendous influence on me, and the fact that she was a colored woman, I think, changed me over the years, but the change only happened when I came to this country, that I began to realize her significance in my life. Now, the other maid that we had was Mariah's sister. Her name was Annie. She didn't have much of an impact on me because she was part-time. She didn't live in our home. However, she had a daughter whose name was Efi, E-F-I-E. And she was my age. And Annie used to bring her with her to my mother when she came on this job to clean up. And this was during the school holidays when EFE was not in her school, the school for coloreds. And she was shy, as was I when I was younger, and didn't have much to do with it. When I was 13, she came a little bit more often. And then Annie and my mother said, why don't you play with EFE? There's nothing to do. So the two of us would sit and play, sit on the floor, and we'd play games, snakes and ladders, and Chinese checkers, Monopoly. We'd listen to the radio. We'd spend a whole afternoon or a whole morning playing. And I can remember teasing her when I was 13 or 14, the way that young teenagers do with girls that they like. Because that's how boys show it. Of that age, they tease the girls. And I really liked her. Nothing happened, but I just really liked her. And I can remember Annie, every now and then, when she was taking a break from her cleaning, she would quietly tiptoe to the sitting room where we were playing. And she'd go up to the door. We wouldn't see it. And all of a sudden, she had to make sure that we weren't doing anything that we shouldn't. Of course, we didn't. We were 13 or 14. So anyway, after Effie became pregnant, we decided. No, I'm kidding. So Effie had a tremendous effect on me because when I was interacting with her, I wasn't aware of her being different from me. She was just another human being, and I didn't see color in her at all. She was intelligent. We liked each other. And I think she had a big influence on me with girls because I went to an all-boys school. At that age, I didn't have any girlfriends. I wasn't interested at that that stage, but I learned how to behave with girls at that age. So she had tremendous influence on me as well. The third servant that we had, his name was goldene. He was a Xhosa. I practiced pronouncing Xhosa. He was from the Xhosa tribe, and he was also lived on our premises in one of the rooms that was off to the side. Didn't have much influence on me, but I remember once going into his room. I went into his room more than once to say hello and look at his room. And his bed was on like 6 bricks. It was a regular bed, but it was raised, so it was like, for me, a little boy, it was this high. And I said to him, why is your bed on so high? I couldn't even climb up. He said his bed is elevated because of the tokolosh. The tokolosh? What's the tokolosh? South Africa is a smile. Tokolosh is a so-called mythical being who, unlike the leprechaun in Ireland, but similar, is malicious. But they're short. So the Africans raise their beds so that they can't reach their victims up on the bed. And he believed that this was so. The Burmans next door also had a Xhosa manservant, and he was nicer. I liked him more than Wilby. And my friend Don and I would often visit James in his room because he was like a cool guy. He had a record player, he had lots of girlfriends, and he was a big, strong guy. And the one thing that we liked going into his room was he had one of those old-fashioned record players from the 1940s or 50s. Remember the wind-up kind? You put a record on, you put the needle on, and then you had to wind it up so it would start spinning. And then the music would play. And as the music, and we didn't like the music as much because it was the African music, which wasn't our thing, but we liked it when it ran out of steam. So that we play it to, and we slow down, it would go, and we would laugh our heads off at the sound that this made. But here's what James did for me. One day, Don and I, it was my Don Merwin next door, we were playing in Don's backyard underneath the loquat tree. It was like we were sitting on the sand, playing with our cars. And where I was sitting, I was looking, I could see the driveway of the Burman's house all the way to Cape Road, which was the street in front of it. About 30-yard long driveway. And as I was sitting there, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. And I looked, and I saw something that I didn't recognize. It was a creature that I didn't recognize. And my first thought was, as a 5-year-old, Don was 6, that this is some kind of a monster. That's what I was thinking, a monster. I should have recognized what it was because it was a common African animal, a baboon. But it was not behaving the way the baboons do. First of all, baboons don't come into cities. They live out in the bush. And they live in packs. 20 to 30 baboons would be a family with one dominant male. This baboon was lone and it was big. And baboons have canines that can be 2 inches long, which tells you that not only are they herbivorous, they're carnivorous as well. They can eat little boys like Don and I. And I stood up and I pointed and I said, Don, what's that? And he turned and he looked, and then this creature saw us and it started coming down the driveway. It made eye contact with us and it was running faster and faster towards us. And I knew it was coming for us. Being little boys, we were in a state of panic or shock, in which a common reaction of both animals and humans, when you're frightened, you're frozen. We just didn't move. Don was standing there, I was standing here. The animal was about 20 feet from us. And suddenly, both he and I at the same time were picked up. Now at this point, I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer by not telling you if I survived or not. It was James. James had just happened to come out of his room. He saw this baboon heading for us, and he knew that this baboon had rabies, which is why it was acting so erratically. Common in South Africa, less common here. He was African. He knew. And without thinking about his own well-being, he rushed and in one fell swoop, he grabbed the two of us under our arms and lifted us up and ran. He didn't stop. He ran, picked us up, continued running for the back door of the kitchen, which was up about 6, 7 or 8 steps. And he ran 2 at a time. The way he was holding us, we were looking backwards. And I could see the baboon gaining on us. We would have been ripped to shreds. But James got to the kitchen door. Luckily, it was open. He pushed that door open and then slammed it shut. And the last view I had was of this baboon reaching out with one of its hands for us. The door slammed, and I heard the baboon's hand strike the door, and then thump as its body hit the door. We were terrified. We stayed in the house, didn't dare to go out for about an hour. And finally, when we went out, James went out with the kitchen door. The baboon was long gone by this time. And on the outside of the door, there was a gouge, a deep gouge of one of its nails on the solid wooden door. The remarkable thing about this story is that here was an African man who worked and got low wages, working for his oppressors, and yet he was willing to risk his life to save the children of his oppressors. So what this tells you is that African, and the stories I'm telling you about Mariah and Effie, that the tremendous impact of the Black people that I dealt with, the few that were involved in my life. My father, who was a doctor, and he only worked with Black, African, and colored patients. He always said to me that the Black people of Africa are the most wonderful people, the best parents, the most reliable parents. And these were examples of the impact that these Black people had on my life. The most difficult story I have for you is this one. After I come to this country, my mother passed away in 1995. What's the time? My mother had passed away, and I went back for the funeral. And after the funeral, my brother and I had to decide what to do with all the furniture and stuff, and we decided what we were going to keep. And Gladys, who was my mother's maid, was going to lose her job in just the next few days after we cleared out the house. And I said to her, I want you, Gladys, I want you to take all these things, the plates and the mops and brooms and the toaster and the iron, all this stuff. And she was a little reluctant to take the electrical stuff. She was happy to take it. It was not the electrical stuff. She said, take it, you'll be able to use this. So we piled all this stuff in the rental car that I had, and we headed out for Uitenhage, which is the town where she lived with her family, 30 miles away. I know that she had a couple of daughters, and I think her mother lived there, looked after the children when she was working. And she would get up once a week to go and see her family, and of course, give them the money. But my mother didn't pay her much, but paid her more than the going rate. And so when I got into Uitenhage, and she was sitting in the front, and the back was just packed with all the stuff that we were giving her, I said to her, now, Gladys, tell me when we get to your street, tell me when to turn. She told me when to turn. Nice buildings, nice houses, and we were driving, and finally this road became a dirt road. Now the houses were not so good. And we continued driving. I said, tell me when we get there. I was expecting one of these houses will be hers, and keep going. Finally, the road ended. Instead of driving on road, we were now driving on bare ground. Rocks and trees and bushes all over the place, scrubby, dry. And the houses now were hovels. Just corrugated iron, bits of wood, rope tied. On the roof was a corrugated sheet with old tires and rocks to stop them from being blown off by the southeastern gales that blew in this part of the country. And then I went over a rock, and bang, we were tired. I said to Vance, where's your home? She pointed to that one, about 100 yards away. I said, you start unloading the stuff and I'll fix the tire. So within minutes, the car was surrounded by these African people. I didn't feel threatened at all because I knew that these are peaceful people. They were curious. They didn't know what was going on. They helped Gladys ferry all the stuff to her home. And I changed the tire. And the people who were there were dirt poor. Clothes were filthy, ripped and torn. Most of them didn't have shoes. None of the children had shoes. The children, some of them had pants and no shirt. Some of them had a shirt but no pants. That was the level of poverty in which these people lived. And my hands were filthy by this time. And I walked to Gladys's home, and as I got there, a man came running up to me, held up his hand, a tiny bar of soap in his hand. He said, here, you need to wash your hands. I said, oh, I'll wash my hands here. I said, Gladys, do you have a bathroom? He said, no. This guy said, come, I'll take you to the community faucet. There was one tap which supplied cold water to this whole, and it was as far as the eye could see. Just hovels here, there. They weren't crowded together like you see in Brazil or places like that. They were scattered. And after I washed my hands, I came back and I went into her home and I was shocked at what I saw. There was no floor. The floor was the ground. She had a carpet on the ground. You couldn't tell the color of this carpet. There were little bits of furniture all on one side. I said to her, why don't you use this part? She's pointing to see the hole in the roof. When it rains, everything gets wet. It was a one-room building. I don't know, maybe from that sofa to here, and then half of it was, there was a curtain. It was the bedroom with 2 or 3 mattresses on the ground, and that's where they slept. When I returned home, I said to my brother Colin, who owned a small wood store like Home Depot, little miniature version. I said, Colin, I want you to go there, fix up this house and patch that roof. And he did. And here's the thing, I didn't realize the circumstances under which Gladys lived, and the circumstances under which many Black Africans lived. I did not know. And I'm sure you've heard the refrain that after the Second World War, when people talk to German people, just ordinary German people, they didn't know what was happening to the Jews. I believe them. Because I didn't know. I knew that the Africans were being oppressed, but not to this extent. I believe those Germans. The reason that we finally came here was because of apartheid. I and some friends had formed a volleyball league in Cape Town. It was highly successful. When I went back to my home for my vacations from medical school, I did the same thing in Port Elizabeth. I got people together, we formed a league there, and it spread around the country. And I was one of the leading forces that did this. And after we got all these white clubs going for volleyball, I thought, what can I do next? How about Black clubs? Payback time for what had been provided to me. So I went to a health clinic where there was a hall, and when I was in medical school, we served that health clinic, we saw the patients, and I said, we're going to come and hold a volleyball clinic in here for Black people who live in this area. And we did. I was captain of the university volleyball team. I brought the whole team on this particular evening, but 100 people showed up. And they loved the game. And we kept coming, my team. And we played with them, mixed with them, coached them, played against their team. This was all illegal. I was also on the committee for the provincial organization in volleyball. So we used to meet in each other's houses. When we met in my home, my apartment, the committee came for all these different clubs. And I thought, I need for these Black people to see how to run a league. And 2 or 3 of them would come and they'd sit in and listen. Sometimes I had players come to the University of Cape Town and practice with us. All this was illegal. Even those meetings with black people in a white person's home, illegal at that time. I could have been arrested. Then something started to happen. I used to communicate with my mother with letters. And I got a letter one day and it had been opened and patched up with sticky tape. My mother must have wanted to add a couple of words. But every letter I got from her, had all been opened. So what's going on with my mom? And I called her, what's going on? I asked her, I haven't done that, she said. Then I began noticing that when I made phone calls or received phone calls, within seconds of my speaking to whoever I'm speaking to, I would hear a click. My phone was being tapped. And I knew I was in trouble because I was being watched for what I had done. Because I was the leader of this black outreach. And that took the balance for us. As it was, we didn't want to have our children brought up in this kind of circumstance. Even though we were privileged white, we didn't want that for our children. We wanted to leave. But when this happened, and now I was in danger of being arrested, and I could have been held without bail for 6 months, without trial, my family would have been in real trouble. Within a year, we were gone. And we came to this country. And I was thankful that we had made the move. And coming here and working with black people, that changed me more. So while I think I was not a flaming racist full with hate and malice, I grew up in a circumstance where there was racism that I accepted as normal. But the interaction with a few black people that I had there and when I came here changed me forever. I'm thankful for having come to this country. I think I've run out of time and I'd like to open it up and Vardit, you can leave the question and answer.
I'll come up and join you, John, and we can have a little conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your unique and insightful stories. I think that many people here have learned a lot about South Africa. They've definitely learned a lot about you. and that was also just really enjoyable storytelling. So I'm going to take a quick look at the time. So I'm going to start with a few questions, a bit of a conversation with John about storytelling. And of course, if you have questions for me, you can feel free to ask. But I wanted to start with how you became a storyteller and also as a storyteller, what the most memorable feedback for you has been in your career. Can you walk us through your career a little bit as a storyteller?
So I started with Toastmasters, and I'm 100% sure that at this university there is a Toastmasters club, there may be more than one. And the reason that I did it was because I was going to be, as a doctor, I was going to be in a consulting firm, and it required me to speak. I had no experience with speeches. I asked my brother, what do I do? Toastmasters. And that was 27 years ago. It was the best thing, apart from my education as a doctor, it was the best thing I did for myself. And I encourage the students here. It will change your life if you do that. The number one thing that an employer looks for is communication, the ability to communicate. And that's what you will learn from Toastmasters. And through that, someone once told me, heard me speak, and they said, have you heard of storytelling organization? I forget the name now, in Washington, D.C. I said, no. She said, you tell some great stories, you should go. And so I started storytelling. And from there, I would perform. I've given speeches in colleges and a couple of theaters up in England, and won speaking competitions, all because of Toastmasters and my brother's influence.
What's your brother's influence through this?
That was it. It's the joint Toastmasters. I did it, and it's the best thing I ever did for myself. Yes.
Okay, cool. And can you tell us a bit more about your process of composing stories, and especially, I'm especially curious in how the process changes when you're telling a story that originates with you, where like the story with Mariah, where you had to come up with something, you just, oh, this is something I want to talk about. And the story that's technically we call it closely, that someone asks you to tell, like now, where I asked if you could tell stories about your migration. So the difference between closely stories and those two
Yes.
different.
So for storytelling, you have to tell a story that involves you, which means you don't have to write. So what I did was wing it today, because all these stories that I told you, I experienced. I didn't have to write them out. But I have this one page here in which I wrote some of the key points that I wanted to tell. I didn't tell you half of them. But that's how I do it. And then I just practice it and go through it in my mind in the shower or in bed or walking around the basement or going for a walk, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, coming up with a few little ridiculous jokes to tell along the way to keep people from falling asleep. It didn't work, people fell asleep anyway. It's the afternoon.
Yeah. And you mentioned to me that you're writing a memoir also. So
Yeah.
can you expand a little bit on the difference between writing your stories and telling your stories, and also maybe what you learned through the process of writing the stories that is in
Yes.
storytelling?
So writing stories is different from telling stories, because the way you write is different from the way you speak. So you can go into a lot more detail when you're writing. And so for all of you, and especially the older folks, you're all going to get old one day too. I highly recommend that when you get older, or even now, that you start taking notes about what happens in life. Keep a diary, fantastic. Because one day you'll start writing these stories out. And when you write them, just as when I started writing that story about Mariah, and that speech that I gave, I called it the speech in Toastmasters, you name your speeches. I called it my other mother. It was only when I started writing it that I realized I had this epiphany of the impact that she had on my life. So writing stories and writing speeches and doing a memoir gets you in contact with your life in a way that you wouldn't otherwise gain, because you're writing detail that makes you think about what happened.
And hope my students remember the life revision narratives that we talked about. It's similar to what you're saying, yeah. Writing about your
So
life.
the other little thing, I saw the pens here. This is for students. What do you think when you see all these pens in my pocket?
Must be really prepared.
Okay, very good. What else? Makes me look like I'm busy, doesn't it? Makes me look important. I'm not using these pens today at all. I just put them in here because it makes me look important. That's for you. I'm not saying you should really do this, but it really makes me think, wow, guy, so many things, it must really be important for all those pens.
I guess the equivalent is walking around with a bunch of phones and tablets.
Yes.
Right, yeah. So I was also curious about directing stories to specific audiences. And I know that you told stories to predominantly Jewish audiences in synagogues, but also you told stories to predominantly non-Jewish audiences, for example, in Toastmasters or other events they've spoken at. How does that influence your storytelling? Have you noticed a way that you tell stories differently to Jewish or non-Jewish audiences?
So much the how I tell the story as the content. I'm not going to talk about a Jewish themes to a predominantly non-Jewish audience. I can remember once I did a speech at a church for African Americans, somewhere in Silver Spring. And I was then in a situation where I was promoting Toastmasters to form new clubs, and this church was interested in Toastmasters. So I had come up with a demonstration of a speech. So I told the speech that had a strong spiritual aspect to it because it was a church. And the curious thing was, a lot of these African Americans had come from the South. So as I was talking about these spiritual things, the response that I got, which told me that I was getting through to them, When I say something, they go, which is typically African American. And so I touched them because of the subject that I chose was appropriate for that audience. I wouldn't have talked about Pesach to a non-Jewish audience. More about my grandfather, his Jewish aspects of his immigration.
And on that theme of audiences, but now moving to storytellers, do you feel that you tell stories differently as someone who isn't American, as a South African, from the American-born storytellers that you've heard?
I think the stories are the same. My stories are always taken from things that happen in my life. And the kinds of stories that I hear from the shows that I attend, that I go to, they all do the same. They talk about stories of events from their lives. There are some storytelling shows where people will tell stories about some myth or some legend, because that's the kind of stories they like to tell. There's some storytellers who tell stories to music, or sing and tell a story. So there are a whole host of different kinds of storytellers.
That you don't feel that as a migrant you have something different.
Well, a lot of the stories that I tell are from experiences in Africa. And so the stories that I tell have a different bent about animals and experiences in the wilds of Africa, which American audiences like to hear. You have to think about, so the fact that I'm telling stories about Africa to an American audience, they've all heard of Africa and they want to know these stories. This is the first time I've talked about apartheid and my experiences with the Black people that I knew, who were largely the people that worked for my parents.
Well, they're great stories, so maybe you'll tell them again.
Yeah.
Well, those are all my questions for you. I think we'll open the floor now to questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that transition period of like realizing that you were being watched for your activity with the volleyball league, and how you got from that point to actually migrating.
It shouldn't have been as easy as it was. But when we realized what was happening and the potential for what would happen if I continued, we decided that the best thing to do was to leave. I was accused by some people of deserting your homeland. You can do stuff for your country. But we felt that we needed to leave. So the first person we contacted was Leanne's sister, who was living in America, married to an American citizen. And they helped us, and we did it all through the US consulate in Cape Town. And at that time, America was encouraging South African doctors, who were wonderful doctors, top-notch training. They were encouraging them to come to America. They were giving them an easy passage to get here. So, which is why within a year we had left. The other thing that I forgot to mention with regard to immigration and how my grandfather was helped by Jews who were in this tiny little town, that Jews help each other. And I'm sure it's not just Jews, other nationalities will help people who are immigrating, whatever the case may be. So one of the first places that I went to do my residency in radiology was in Rochester, New York. I knew nobody. I came first, settled in. But I heard that there was a South African pediatrician in Rochester. I was given his name and his phone number by a relative in South Africa. And when I came here, I phoned him and he was wonderful. He invited me over for dinner several times, for Friday night dinner. And he told me the lay of the land and how to do it and where to shop and the best things to do and what I should avoid, etc., etc. A year later, when I was nicely settled in, Gran was here with kids, a young South African couple came over from South Africa. They knew no one in Rochester, New York, but somebody had given them my name. And they were from, the husband was from Utenade, where Gladys, my mother's maid, had lived. And so we befriended them. They didn't even have a car. We took them and showed them where the shops were. We helped them settle in. They had twin girls, baby twin girls. And then a few years later, 2 Russian families we befriended, and we helped them. One of them, we gave them, needed a loan, and we signed as guarantors of this $3,000 loan to help them, because that's what you do. Especially if you're an immigrant, you know that people come and there are difficulties. Both these Russian families knew nobody. There was another one who was a pediatrician from Russia. She studied in Russia, had practiced in Russia for several years. She tried to get a residency in pediatrics. Nobody would take her because she was from Russia. Despite all her credentials and her experience, nobody would take her. Now, I was incensed. I said to her, which school do you want to go to? She said, Georgetown, because it was local. I said, I'm going to write you a reference letter. So, and I knew her, after several months, I knew her well, and I wrote, so usually you get a reference letter, it's a couple of paragraphs. I wrote 1.5 pages for her. And I talked about how wonderful she is and how good a doctor she was, and I knew because I discussed it with her. And at the end, I said, given the experience of Dr. Meyerowitz, given how much she has learned compared with students who come out of high school and they go into they go into college, and then into a residence, and they know nothing about medicine, and you don't take her. I said, you'd be silly. I used that word. You'd be silly not to take this woman as a resident. Guess what? She got the job. Guess what? In her final year of residency, she was made the chief resident. So that's how immigrants help each other. My cousin Eddie, with a shirt, and his wonderful wife Sandy have done the same thing with foreign people coming to Dallas, Texas, from where they're visiting. 5 people they befriended, and they're still friends with these people. Families, whole families for years, because that's what we do.
It is 87's birthday yesterday, and he got phone calls from Romanians, from Ghanaians, from Russians, and I can't even think, who called to wish him a happy birthday.
These are people that you helped.
They're people we had helped.
Years ago.
Yes, years ago, 20 years ago.
I think we have a question from online.
Yes, we do. How do you feel about the current trajectory of South Africa, and what do you think can help to counter the increasing growth of corruption? There's so much hope with Mandela and all that he stood for. So it's less storytelling, it's more
Yes.
politics explaining.
The situation is dire. Country was better off, and the black people were better off under apartheid than they are now with multiracial rule. People don't see a way out. There's 50% unemployment. Crime is rife. The country's falling apart. The electrical system is falling apart. There are periods of time where there are blackouts for hours at a time, every day. Infrastructure is stolen. The wires overhead, they're tearing off the ties to get the copper, things like that. The electricity there's no upkeep. There are droughts there because dams are leaking because they don't maintain them. How do you get out of this? I think the problem was that the African people, after the change when Mandela took over, the African people expected, okay, it's our turn. But they didn't have the education. The level of education they had was not sufficient for them to take over managerial systems of corporations. They just didn't. And they had to employ black people because they needed this lift up, but it was at the expense of the economy of the country and the functioning, the proper proper governance of the country has failed. It's going to take generations to fix. South Africa has gone the way of Zimbabwe and a lot of the other African countries that are struggling because of this kind of poor governance. Theft, I mean, government officials stealing millions of dollars, millions.
So you, from the questions that came up, you actually spoke about a very different immigrant experience, the idea of helping each other as immigrants. So what made you choose to focus on race and experience of apartheid versus how immigrants help each other when you chose the framework of the story today?
Because I just wanted people to know I wanted to focus on the apartheid system, the Black people that I knew as something that helped develop my personality, rather than on the immigration side.
Marshall, I saw that you read that.
Yeah, given the fact that the large percent of the immigrants to South Africa were Litvaks and made essentially a Litvak community, how did any Litvak tradition affect the relations with the Afrikaners, Blacks? There was anything particular, one way or the other, from the tradition that came with them that may have separated how other Jews might have dealt with the situation? But any traditions that came from Lithuania per se that had you could say by hindsight, had some impact and how their relations to the rest of the country developed?
Most of those immigrants who came from Eastern Europe, the Jewish ones, were poor. And I think that influenced them to help Black people. So the Jewish population in South Africa, out of proportion to other religions or other white groups, did more to help the African people. They were involved politically and in the anti-apartheid movement. Eddie's brother-in-law was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, heavily involved. He had to just about flee the country because he was on the verge of being arrested. So, and I think that stemmed from, so the Jews really identified with the shocking situation of the Black people. And yet, I think that, like me, they still took advantage because they all had maids. I don't think they paid them huge amounts of money, and yet most Jews who went to South Africa were highly successful because of the Yiddish call. I think Jews could have done more. There were the few who stuck their necks out and did a lot to try and help them. I think largely the South African Jewry didn't really help as much as they might have. But as I said, they did more than what other groups did.
All righty, we have a question from the audience. Marcel, can you unmute, please? Oh, there you go. My apologies.
Hi, hello everybody. I am a former South African, and I'd like to add something to John's comments. First of all, with regard to how Judaism influenced some of us, because I know growing up, my parents would say that we as Jews had been discriminated against, and so we had no right to discriminate against any other people. And I think that resonated with all of us who heard these comments, and most of my friends, John, I should say, thought that and felt that. Many people felt, young people felt they couldn't change the government, but their views on apartheid were very clear, that apartheid was unacceptable. And we had to either, if we couldn't change we had to leave. We couldn't live under that system, which is what John was articulating about himself. But I think that, for example, the Progressive Party in South Africa had a Jewish woman who represented the opposition. So I think, John, you're underestimating the protests that young Jewish people at university held, and the way we were not violent demonstrators, but there was definitely an understanding of the horrors of apartheid among young Jewish people. So I just want to put that in the mix. Thank you.
So I was involved in some of those protests while I was in university, but it didn't help the situation. I think it took an international effort, sanctions and sports sanctions, to finally change things, and for the then president, white president, to realize that this was not going to end well. That eventually there would be a violent overthrow. And even when Mandela was coming to power, when we realized that this is the end of apartheid and of white rule, whites were still afraid that now there was going to be bloodshed. And to Mandela's credit, he was an incredible leader, prevented it. Things began to fall apart after Mandela stopped governing the country, and other Africans took over. They weren't as good as he was in keeping the system whole. If he'd continued, if he'd taken over as a younger man, things may be very different for South Africa. Would have allowed more time for things to change. You had a question?
Yeah. So it might be a little bit targeted of a question, but when we talk about different immigrant groups paying it forward, I'm wondering, similar to the United States, where the founding Jewish communities were these Portuguese Jewish communities, and you have people like Emma Lazarus shaping the modern Jewish, philosophy and mindset. Were the founding Portuguese Jews who originally came to South Africa, did they affect the modern South African Jewish mindset in any way? Were there any people who affected in that way?
So predominantly it was Lithuanian Jews. I mean, they came from all over Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And so they really shaped the system in the Jewish life in South Africa heavily. They all spoke Yiddish. The little town I was in, Port Elizabeth, 150,000 people, there was a Yiddish comedian came to town. And I remember my parents taking me, and the Feather Market Hall was packed, probably over 1,000 people, all who spoke Yiddish. So that's how heavy the influence of the Lithuanian Jews was, and of Yiddish speakers was. Did that answer your question?
More or less.
Another online
Alrighty,
question.
another good one from Mindy. Were Jews discriminated against in apartheid South Africa? And a follow-up, did rabbis in South Africa take any stand in their sermons against South Africa? Were there rabbinical seminaries in South Africa? And if yes, did they take a stand against apartheid?
So if there hadn't been a black problem in South Africa, it would have been a Jewish problem. Because the government was not only anti-black from the point of view of forcing apartheid, they were also anti-Semitic. It was kind of undercover a little bit because the efforts were mainly geared towards maintaining the apartheid system and dealing with the Jews. And yet the Jews contributed a tremendous amount to the economy and to the success of the country. They were major owners and CEOs of big companies in South Africa. What was the other part of the question?
Did rabbis in South Africa take any stand in their sermons against South Africa and apartheid?
I heard a few rabbis talking about the apartheid system and the wrongs of it. But they weren't heavily outspoken because they could have been arrested for doing that.
Jason.
Were there any moments or experiences that you had once you came to this country that either made you realize the differences between the United States and South Africa, or maybe just if there was anything that was similar as well?
Talk about with regard to race?
Yes.
Absolutely. So when I came here and I worked in the first hospital that I worked at, where there were African Americans who had the same job that I was, working shoulder to shoulder. Never had that in South Africa. It was a unique experience and eye-opening. It was hard to get used to because the Black Africans in South Africa, those who, for example, our maids or people who worked in stores, Black people did work in white stores. They needed the labor. They were all very differential to white people. Whereas coming here, there was none of that. There was no African American who was, oh, you're a white person from South Africa, better treat you nice. That didn't happen. It was a totally different atmosphere. The relationship was totally different.
Yeah. Said you're in a way you're racist. Does that, do you mean in terms of benefiting or privileging from the system itself, this racially based system of apartheid, or because you held views that saw Africans or Black South Africans as inferior per se? Is there a difference between
So
the
it was
two?
both. So because I lived in a white suburb with this big house and had all these sporting activities and vacations and all that, and Black people didn't, this is as a child I'm talking, that I kind of thought to myself, white people are better because we are better. Look at what we have and they don't have it, even though it was forced upon them. It wasn't their choice. They didn't get the education. Mariah was illiterate, couldn't read or write. I used to read letters for her that she would get from her family in Afrikaans because she couldn't read them. The second part of your question.
No, so whether that was kind of reflective of this sense that you are superior to the inferior Black person on the street, servant, the provider of the worker in whatever position.
So what I learned from the non-white people that I dealt with, like our mates and James next door and Gladys, my mother's, was that what I learned is that there were people just like me, and they were put under a system which made them seem inferior because they didn't have the opportunities. They didn't have the money to buy and build nice houses. So that thought of mine that I was better was a fallacy because it was not true. They were wonderful people. It was reflected in how they treated me, even though I was their oppressor.
Any more questions on Zoom or in person? No? Okay, well, before we finish, we have for you, John, a little thank you. This book, Jewels, Teasing Out the Poetry in Jewish Humor and Storytelling, edited by Steve Zeitlin, which I hope you will enjoy, and maybe it will help you think a bit more about the poetry and humor in your own storytelling.
Well, thank you so much. This is right up my alley.
I never would have guessed.
I'll tell you a funny story. I was asked to give a talk to a group of Japanese students. I can't remember where it was. And I was told they will give you a gift. And I did some research. I always, if I'm going to talk to a group of people, I want to know who they are. Who am I going to talk to? Who's your audience? I need to know who your audience was. And I read that in Japanese culture, if somebody offers you a gift, you decline. And they'll say, no, take it, decline. But the third time, accept. So I learned two words. I can't remember what they were. I learned to say hello and I learned to say thank you. And then when it came time and they had this gift, I said, oh, no, I don't deserve this. I can't accept it. And they said, no, please, we want you to have this gift. No. And then she says, no, really, we want you to have it. Okay, thank you. And the whole audience erupted because they knew that I knew what their culture was. And so, no, I can't accept it.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful event of storytelling and this great insight into South African Jewish life and South African American Jewish life.
My pleasure, my absolute pleasure. Can I show you something before I go?